Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Lucy's Science Library. Today's Strange Stuff Sundays, a new segment where we talk about everything and anything relating to sci-fi or science, really anything other than the regular book reviews. And today we got a special one for you. This is my top 10 reasons why you should read vintage sci-fi. Let's just get right into it with reason number 1. It's cheap. Now, if you go to a used bookstore, thrift store, heck, even a garage sale, you can usually find a small stack of these paperbacks for dirt cheap prices. Like, you can buy an entire book for 50 cents. What other hobby could you have where you spend less than you would spend to buy a candy bar to get a few hours of entertainment? Come on, that's pretty compelling. I know when I was younger, I didn't have a whole lot of money to just be throwing around at random different hobbies. So I think that's part of the reason I even stuck with it in the first place, is that it's so attainable. Anybody and everybody can go find these books. Reason number 2, and probably a big reason that a lot of us got into the genre in the first place, is the artwork and book covers. I'm going to have a couple montages of these going across the screen. Everything from the vintage Amazing Stories covers, which you can see here, all the way up to the 50s and 60s paperback prints, some of which that I have on my shelf sitting there right now. Another montage about to go across the screen. Just absolutely beautiful. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this artwork is so cool and interesting and weird, especially when compared against the artwork of its contemporaries. But there is a fantastic Nerd Writer video about that, so I'm going to link that below because he describes it way better than I ever could. Definitely go give that a watch. It'll inspire you for sure. Moving right along to reason number 3, authors who were scientists. Now, this is a thing that I was always really inspired about when reading old vintage sci-fi, is that a lot of the authors who were writing it were actual scientists or specialists in their field. So a lot of these stories had a lot of technical aspects that are just way more accurate than you would expect from, stories about spacemen and aliens and traveling into other worlds. The mathematics and science for these books can be really on point depending on who wrote them. Just for a quick example, when talking about the big 3 sci-fi authors, Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, all 3 of them were very, very educated and well informed about what they were talking about. Isaac Asimov, on top of writing over 500 books and being able to speak 3 languages, was pretty much just in general a genius. He had a degree in chemistry from Columbia University, as well as being a professor of biochemistry at Boston University's School for Medicine. And that doesn't even touch his knowledge of history or his brief service in the US Navy during World War II and what he was doing with them. Speaking of the US Navy, and another big sci-fi writer that can be connected to it, Robert Heinlein graduated from the US Naval Academy with essentially a bachelor's in arts of engineering. For a guy who's famous for his military science fiction that's still talked about to this day, I think it's pretty safe to say he knew what he was writing about. We could also talk about one of my favorite authors, Arthur C. Clarke, who on top of serving as a radar specialist during World War II, also had a first-class degree in mathematics and physics from the King's College of London. On top of all of this even, some of his papers and short stories laid the idea groundwork for our first geostationary satellites. I mean, who else has those kinds of credentials? And this only scratches the surface of the authors who are overqualified to be authors. There are tons of scientists / sci-fi authors from this era that makes for really great reading. So if you're the kind of person that really likes detailed sci-fi or the application of science concepts in a real way, a lot of these authors are going to hit right on the mark for you. Building off from this and going to reason number 4 are the ideas. Old science fiction gets a lot of crap for not having necessarily the best storylines or written characters, but it doesn't matter, and the reason that we're still talking about it to this day is because of the ideas that it presents. You will not find another genre with the depth and intricacy of the ideas that get brought up in vintage sci-fi. We're talking about stuff like technology and politics, artificial intelligence, what it means to be human, exploring the unknown, using scientific methods to get out of problems. Really cool stuff that's really unique to this era of sci-fi and the sci-fi genre in general. And it's this talk about ideas that leads us to our reason number 5, and a huge part of why a lot of people still like this genre is the predictions for the future. Now, to be fair, this one can vary depending on who you read. Some people were way off in their predictions of the futures, and some people like Asimov and Heinlein were pretty scarily close. A thing we often take for granted as modern day readers is writings about race and feminism and other topics that at the time that these sci-fi books were written were incredibly taboo. Authors such as Octavia Butler, Ursula K. Le Guin were writing about these topics in a way that challenges readers even to this day. Like seriously, I challenge anybody to read The Left Hand of Darkness and not really rethink everything that they know about gender. And the authors that wrote about these progressive visions of the future were not the minority in sci-fi. Heinlein, famously at the time he released Starship Troopers, got a lot of crap for making the main character a Filipino man that spoke Tagalog, but he didn't reveal it till the end of his book, so that 50s and 60s audiences would become connected with the character, only to find out at the end. Another great example of this forward thinking comes from Arthur C. Clarke's 2-page short story called Reunion. You can find it in the Wind from the Sun compilation. Man, if you want to be mind blown in just a couple paragraphs, and then think about in the context of when it was released, read this story. You will not regret it. Even if you're not into reading about predictions of our social future or how culture progresses, man, even the predictions for technology could be really spot on. It's kind of scary how accurate Isaac Asimov's robot series has come to basically pass in real life. Like, we can see the beginnings of his robot series happening in our society right now, with driverless cars, trucks, and automation all taking their forms. Moving away from some of the heavier concept stuff and into reason number 6 as to why you should read vintage sci-fi is that a lot of these books are small and quick to get through. Now, this might seem like a contradiction to what I said earlier about hours of entertainment. Well, that's just because you can buy a lot of these books for dirt cheap. But a lot of them really are just, 100, 150-page books that you could get through in a day or an afternoon. And this is great for a lot of reasons. One, if you're not a big reader or you're just getting into reading, this is perfect genre to try to dip your toes into. You don't have to get some huge, overarching fantasy series or some really deep, convoluted mystery that's hard to read. Nope, you just got quick book, quick idea, and straight to the punch. And if you are a big reader, but you might just be into other genres like fantasy, like classics, whatever it might be, this is also a perfect genre to try. So you can grab one of these books, be done with it in an afternoon, and know real quick whether or not you like vintage sci-fi. There's a lot of benefits. Speaking of classics, and moving into reason number 7, the classics in sci-fi are very accessible. Now, there's lots of big, pretty, fancy editions for a lot of classic books, but if you want to get to the straight meat and potatoes of it, sci-fi classics are generally pretty short and very readily available. I mean, look at that. We got War of the Worlds right here, which you could see on some modern bookshelves as being these big, huge, leather-bound volumes. But in reality, this is how long the story is. Absolutely crazy. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Get tons of volumes that look huge, look really intimidating on a shelf. But if you go back and find those classic copies, they're thin. It's just the story, no huge essays or all this analytical stuff you have to read. You can read the classics for yourself and think about them what you want for yourself. And I think that's great. This also means you can read a lot of them. If you're someone who's always wanted to read classic books, but you could just never find the motivation or time just based on how intimidating they looked or how old they are, this is a great place to start. These classic sci-fi books are everywhere, and they're so fast to read through. I mean, even stuff like I, Robot, which looks a little bit intimidating, it's really just a collection of short stories. You could fly through that in a weekend. And Then, once you start reading even more, you can get to some even heavier classics. I know a lot of y'all are interested in reading Dune after the most recent movie. Guess what that counts as? Sci-fi classic. And one of the best-selling sci-fi books of all time. So it's pretty readily available. You don't even have to get this pretty edition like I got. There's all kinds of thrift store copies, old ones that people have just given away. That's awesome. It really goes back to what we were saying earlier too about these books being cheap. You can start gathering up these classics really quick and fill a shelf to impress your friends if you're into that sort of thing. Reason number 8, and it kind of ties back to the idea reason before, is the originality factor of a lot of these stories. Now, originality is a little bit of a hard thing to classify. I mean, what's really original? Who hasn't done this idea? You can get into a rabbit hole with that sort of thing. But when compared against what's really popular now in movie theaters and in, big name publisher books, it's amazing just how many interesting, unique, one-off kind of ideas you will find in vintage sci-fi that you will never find again anywhere else. And if you find yourself a short story compilation, which was incredibly popular at that time, you'll get a ton of these ideas. You'll get like a dozen or more. Real bang for your buck, all in the same volume. If you decide to go this route, I highly recommend anything edited by John Campbell or Donald Wollheim, particularly his annual World's Best Sci-Fi from honestly the 70s through the 80s. They're all pretty great. And moving to the next reason, which is connected to this, is reason number 9, the discovery. On top of having lots of really cool one-off type concepts, most people don't know that these books are out there and available, meaning you can find all kinds of really unique stories and all kinds of really cool, just different books from what you normally read. And you could be one of the only people that you know that knows about these books. It's like your own little best kept secret. To me, that's really exciting. And even though there's all kinds of like organizations or YouTube channels or, just websites that try to gather all these books and classify them and talk about them, the sheer volume of stories and books is just so immense that I don't personally think anybody could collect them all. So this makes it kind of fun, like a little treasure hunt when you're going through a used bookstore, just looking for old volumes of these books and finding all kinds of weird stuff. Like I said in an earlier video, man, if it just has like a cheesily drawn robot on it and I've never heard of it before, probably gonna grab it just to see what's up. And lastly, with reason number 10 to kick off this video, if you're still not sure about reading vintage sci-fi, one more cool aspect that we need to talk about is the genre blending. Vintage and classic sci-fi authors usually didn't really care much about their stories. They are more about presenting the idea and talking about it and the implications of it. Because of this, you can find tons of sci-fi stories that are really just other types of stories with scientific elements in it. Like my favorite example is probably Caves of Steel by Isaac Asimov. The story talks about robots and the future of Earth and what he thinks will happen with that. But the actual storyline is a detective mystery novel where they try to solve a murder. That's really engaging. I like that aspect of it, and it's really cool to be able to read all kinds of different types of stories and get a broad sense of all kinds of reading while still sticking within a sci-fi genre that you really like. Now, I'm not going to beat a dead horse talking about this topic, because there are other YouTubers who've released lists about what type of sci-fi books you should read if you like fantasy or westerns or romance. But the sheer fact that we can have those lists and that we can have that kind of discussion is really cool. To me, it makes sci-fi more broad in a way that other genres of fiction just aren't. And I think that's really cool and unique. So yeah, those are my top 10 reasons why you should read vintage sci-fi. If you can think of any more that I didn't cover, or maybe you wanted to talk about, please leave them in the comments. This could be great for anybody who's maybe looking up this video, not sure if they want to start reading these kinds of books. Any kind of encouragement would be great, because we want to grow this community as much as we can. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week. Ha! Just kidding. There's still going to be a bunny clip at the end of this video. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. See ya.